Awesome. Great. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for not only joining us today, but for bearing with us over the technical difficulties. So today, this webinar is in partnership with Spark Festival, and it's on the topic of climate impact investing, and it's a Q&A with Steve Gross from Palisade. So my name is Anna. I'm the Growth Marketing Manager at Bloom, and I'm going to be your host today. Before we sort of jump in, I wanted to very quickly acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners of the land on which this meeting is taking place, which for me is Mianjin, Brisbane. I recognise the country north and south of Brisbane River as the home of both the Turrbal and Jagera nations, and I pay my deep respects to the elders past, present and future. So welcome again. It is such a pleasure to see you all. For any new customers out there today, or any new Bloom community members, let me very quickly introduce Bloom and the purpose of today's event. So Bloom is really here to empower people to invest, to do well and to fight against climate change. We're on a mission to make climate impact investing easy and accessible. And part of this mission is to offer educational opportunities like these webinars to propel the voices of impact investing and sustainable finance experts far and wide. The aim of the webinar is to build a community of impact investors and people using their money for good. So we want to build a greener, more circular and inclusive economy together. Very quick housekeeping, as you know already, this session is being recorded and the webinar will be made available to the attendees of the event via email. And I just have to do a very quick note from our lawyers, which is please be aware that the information provided in this webinar will be general in nature only and does not constitute personal financial advice. Before acting on any information from this presentation, you should consider how appropriate that information is in regards to your objectives, financial situation and needs. And finally, I just want to mention that this is a safe space here. You can ask any question you want throughout the event, and you can sort of just do that by typing in the chat or popping in the Q&A. I'm going to start off by asking our speakers some questions, and then I'm going to try and leave 50 minutes to the end for Q&As. So welcome again, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't think you need much of an introduction, but I'm maybe going to go ahead and just do a quick overview if that's okay with you, Steve.
No problem, please do.
So Steve is the CEO and co-founder of Palisade Impact. He is a big believer that social and climate justice is intertwined. Through his work at Palisade, he is helping the public find scalable and high quality solutions to address both. Steve has over 25 years of experience in impactful infrastructure and in building and growing businesses around the world. His experience covers investment origination, execution and management, as well as business development. Steve is also the inaugural chair of Homes Victoria, which oversees 26 billion of social and affordable housing in Victoria. And to sort of round off his busy schedule, he's also actively supports several not-for-profit organisations, including Berry Street, which he's also a member of the board. So thank you again and welcome, Steve. Thank you so, so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here. So, and thanks for the kind introduction as well.
Of course. So I do have some questions, but I sort of wanted to hand the mic over to you if there was anything you wanted to sort of say before we jump into the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. I think I'd probably start by saying, you know, my parents have always been deeply involved in doing the right thing by society. You know, my dad was in the military for many years and in the civil service for many years after that. And my mum has chaired many charities, including is a big supporter of First Nations causes. My mum was woke before woke was a thing. I think a very powerful and formidable lady who always taught me and my family a lot about doing the right thing. And I think as I've got older and have been fortunate to develop skills and have people take chances on me. And have kids that are safe and healthy and in good schools, I feel the onus continues to be on me and increasingly on me and people like me to use what we have to do good. And for me, it's not money is helpful, as people would always say who have money. But what we can really bring is our sort of time, capability and intellect to solving really big, serious social problems and climate problems. And for me, a country like Australia in particular, despite, all the great wealth that we have, faces huge climate and inequality challenges. And I think it's beholden on us to invest wisely, because investing wisely are the most scalable solutions. And that's, for me, where impact investing comes into it. I think it's really important that we recognise that, these challenges are a $7 trillion a year challenge, and philanthropy is $90 billion a year. And that gap has to be filled with financial private sector solutions, right? So for me, that's what impact investing is all about. How can we catalyse money into these sectors by driving really strong financial returns for investors, so they keep investing and bringing more capital behind it so we can solve more? But the second thing is, that shouldn't be the purview of institutional investors. That should be the purview of everyone. So if what I think is fantastic about what Bloom does is it democratises investment in climate-friendly investments and in some cases social investments. And the more we can have of that, the better. We know clearly that high net worth capital and retail capital dwarfs the institutional market, yet the opportunities to those parts of the market are substantially less. So how can we bring those two things together? Anyway, as usual, I talk too much. I'll hand it back to you, Anna. Sorry about that.
No, thank you. That was great. And it really sounds like you've absolutely followed in the steps of your parents. They've obviously set a really good example for you that you've sort of followed along.
Yeah,
you have stolen a little bit of my thunder with sort of that debrief, because my first question was going to be, tell me about your background and journey with impact investing. But I have a feeling there's a lot more to the story than what you've just sort of said in those first few seconds. So tell me, how did you sort of get into Palisade? How did you sort of start impact investing? I know you've been a part of it for a long time.
Yeah, sure. I took a sabbatical in 2019. I'd been travelling pretty much for most of my kids' lives and wanted to take a few months off to spend time with them. At the time, I think they were 15 and 13, and they're 17 and 15 now, two girls. And I really enjoyed having that opportunity to do that. But it also gave me a chance to think a lot about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to spend my time, and that whole thing of sort of prioritising what was important to me. And I really wanted to find a way to get to the nexus of doing good, but also using the skills that I've learnt in finance. And, I have many people at Macquarie to thank for helping develop my career and take a chance on me in many ways. And I thought hard about going into philanthropy and running a charity. And where I came out was, I felt that impact investing really provided that kind of nexus between doing good and finance. I think there's the Warren Buffett story where he talks about, if a horse can count to 4 on its hoof, it makes it an amazing horse, not an amazing mathematician. And I was very much the amazing horse when it came to philanthropy. I was good and I was a good-hearted banker, but ultimately I'm still a financial guy, and there's a lot of stuff that I can continue to do in that space and grow and develop. So I spent a lot of time thinking through that and meeting some really cool people as part of that conversation, and who were incredibly generous with their time, introducing me to their colleagues and spending time helping me understand the sector in that period. So, people like Sally McCutcheon and Dan Madivan and Michael Trail and Ian Lemoff all were very, very kind with how they spent time with me, and I'll be always thankful for that. And I sort of formed my own view of what I felt, the gap in the sector was and how I could be helpful. and use that to sort of formulate a plan of how I'd do that back at Macquarie. And we sort of spent a couple of years sort of setting up an impact investing platform at Macquarie, including working with people like Lisa George and the foundation around how we could sort of do that. And we sort of progressed that nicely. COVID hit, and then I was like, well, I was at home more, spending more time with family, and just realised it was time for me to own my own day and run my own business, and it was kind of now or never. And so I made the decision to leave Macquarie, and then it was a really easy decision from there to sort of select to work with Palisade Impact and set that up. And I'm really fortunate that my co-founder, Jeremy Werner's a great friend who I've known for 30 years. We're absolute complements. He's a good listener and I'm a good talker, as an example. There's a few more things, but that's the obvious one. And I work with a guy named Todd Smith, who's a former deputy CFO at Sydney Airport, who was in charge of sustainability. And we've recently brought in a lady named Villia Robinson, who was formerly part of the Palisade business, who's an absolute rock star as well. So we've got a cool team, and then we partner with Palisade, who I think are the best mid-market infrastructure manager in Australia, but as importantly, have a great sort of family environment and a lovely group of human beings who, are an absolute pleasure to deal with as well.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like a really exciting and I guess fruitful career that you've had. Out of curiosity, you mentioned that you thought about going into charity and setting up your own charity. Just out of curiosity, what charity would you have set up?
I don't think I would have set up a charity myself. I would have worked for another charity. And thankfully for charities, I didn't. But my wife has set up my wife has set up a charity called You Matter, which furnishes homes for women that are victims of domestic violence. And my wife is a badass of the highest order. And I was very fortunate that she spent a lot of time when I was building my career, looking after and raising the kids beautifully. And now she sort of saw a big problem and set up a charity. It's now chaired by one of the great ladies of philanthropy as well, Sandy DeWolf, and my wife's effectively sort of running that with her. So we've also got that sort of in the background, as well as having a year 12 student as well. So we got a few things going on.
I think you hate sleep and rest, Steve. It's starting to sound.
No. As one of my old bosses said, you don't have a work problem, you've got a sleep problem. But no, we manage it all pretty well. And again, just very lucky. I've got an amazing wife and two kids that fill the hole.
Amazing, awesome. Oh God, I've just had a bee fly into my office. Next question. Can you tell us a bit more about the Palisade race to can you tell us a bit more about the Palisade race to zero investment belief and mandate?
Okay. I'll start talking now. Put yourself on mute. Get rid of the Yeah, no problem. I'll be able to talk. Don't worry about it. So in terms of the Palisade race to zero, we sort of see there being three big challenges, which is the race to zero emissions, so zero carbon emissions in all its form, zero waste, so moving to greater recycling, reuse, and getting more value out of the things we use and reusing them. And then the third is around the race to zero inequality. And when we think about zero inequality, we're very focused on how we can get more of the right kind of infrastructure to more Australians. And the right kind of infrastructure for us is infrastructure that's smarter, greener, more connected and more affordable. One of the big challenges you have in Australia is that Australia is a huge country, but has a relatively small population, which means the cost per capita of infrastructure is significant, which means that it's difficult for people in urban and rural Australia, as well as the divide between rich and poor is quite significant in terms of the quality of infrastructure. The way we think you can solve that is getting infrastructure that's decarbonised, decentralised, and also digitised. So how do we get that type of infrastructure to complement the existing infrastructure? And that for us is very much where we deliver our impact. It's finding those new areas of next generation infrastructure, helping them grow, and then actively helping them drive impact and measuring it and reporting on it to the clients, and then holding both our investee companies and ourselves accountable for delivering impact. We see that as a sort of core part of our proposition, and we think that's important, not only an investor perspective, but also an investee company perspective. One of the big challenges you have in Australia is next generation infrastructure tends to fall in a gap between traditional infrastructure, where all the big super funds play on one side, and then on the other, growth equity, where it sort of sees infrastructure as being a bit too low risk and sort of capital intensive. We try and fill a gap in the middle and provide long-term capital and assistance with growth and a real alignment on impact that a lot of these next generation infrastructure companies need.
Amazing. Awesome. Thank you, Steve. I'm most happy to report I got the B and I was able to shoo it out safely.
Outstanding. The B's being still around is a good sign, though.
Absolutely, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much. So I guess my next question is, how do you think Palisade will create additionality and genuine climate impact in the space?
Yeah, so for us, we focus on a couple of things. So for us, first thing, we focus on sectors where there's a lot less capital than is needed in that sector. So we focus on areas where you're going into next generation infrastructure. So sectors where they're enabled by new technology, it's more distributed infrastructure, but it's very different. It's very different to your traditional infrastructure in terms of its scale, but less capital is in that space. So we want to provide that. It's also in terms of the nature of the capital we provide. So most of the capital that is available for next generation infrastructure typically is shorter term capital. But what these businesses need is long-term capital to help it realise its potential. So the funds we manage are long-term funds, so open-ended funds that can go the distance with the companies. And then the third thing is we actively help the businesses grow. And we help them grow in two ways. The first is that we want to help businesses acquire new customers, help them deploy capital to create more infrastructure. So our capital we want to bring in to be longer term, but also to assist growth. But we also want these businesses to grow inorganically. So one of the big challenges you have in the next generation market is it's quite a fragmented market. You have a number of businesses that are doing similar things, but not at scale. So we want to be a catalyst for bringing those businesses together. So for us, it's about differentiated type of capital, and also what we do with our money. So we want to actively help those businesses grow at the same time. So we don't typically want to go into sectors where there's a lot of money. So traditional waste, traditional renewable energy. We want to go into distributed energy, and we want to go into battery storage, which isn't a key enabler, but a relatively new market in that space. We want to go into things like recycling in all its forms, paper, plastics, tyres, but even other forms of recycling. If we can go into a business that will increase the recycling rates of a more traditional waste business. And we can help that by bringing in a new type of technology to help with the recycling and do it more effectively to a higher level, then we'd look at doing that as well.
Amazing. So why do you think it's quite hard for individuals and asset managers to invest in clean energy projects? And how do you think Palisade and Bloom sort of breaches that gap?
Sure. So I think it comes from two sides. I think when it comes to sort of smaller investors, typically, if you're a fund manager in the PE space or in the infrastructure space, your targets are either sort of traditional institutional capital, or it will be at the lower side, might be high net worth type capital. I think the beauty of running a new business that's going into this space is you have to do things differently. And for me, that means, how do I work with a group like Bloom, who can access a broader range of smaller investors? I find that really appealing, because I think on one side, I think that's, on the sort of capitalist side of me, I see that as being a really big opportunity. On the other side of my brain, it really appeals to me to see a lot of people who would not otherwise access this being sort of able to access it. So for me, the way Bloom is set up, where you're effectively a sort of single investor going into one fund, it's a great model that hasn't come here before, and it's enabled digitally, so it works really well, which is the key challenge with it. So for me, it's a simple interface with a really cool counterparty, and from the perspective of the investor, it's a really simple interface with a really cool counterparty. So it kind of works through the Bloom interface, I think.
And what do you think it's been previously to, Bloom? Why has it been harder for individuals to access those assets? Is it's just not available? Has there not been demand? What do you think are the reasons why prior to Bloom it hasn't been really accessible at a general sort of population level?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way investors typically go into clean energy assets, for example, is through a fund structure. So, a typical trust structure where, hundreds of millions of dollars are raised, and then from that fund, you'll invest, $50, $100 million into an underlying investment into clean energy. So if you're a smaller investor, it's both too complex a process to go into that fund typically, on one side. On the other side, those fund managers, if they don't want to deal directly with thousands of investors, they just want to deal with 20 large investors. What Bloom does is bridge that gap on both sides. So from a small investor perspective, you're dealing with Bloom directly. It's a digitized process. It's easy to get in and work with the system. You don't have to go through a clunky paper-based process, lots of, due diligence and sort of money laundering questionnaires you've got to fill in and all of that kind of stuff. It's quite painful, and it's painful for me to do that, and I do this for a living, and it takes me days to fill in these, documents. So for someone for whom it's quite new, it's a painful process. But then on the other side, for me, I'm just dealing with one counterparty. I don't have to deal with the processing of it. I can deal with multiple individuals through conversations and all of that kind of stuff, which I like doing, but I don't have to deal with the direct administration on the other side, which is super helpful as well. So, and then the other part is a lot of these funds are quite hard to access generally, even for institutional investors. And so I think Bloom has done a great job, becoming a partner with some really cool funds out there, which means that your investors can access them, which in itself is not an easy thing to do.
Absolutely. Shout out to our investment manager, Dan, for making it all happen.
Yeah.
Awesome. So can you tell us a bit more about Esko and I know it's one of the assets in the Palisade Fund that Bloom investors can sort of invest in. Are there any other assets aside from Esko that you're really excited about at the moment?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just checking some of the questions. All right, that's cool. I'll get onto those in a sec.
Yeah, we'll get to those.
Yeah. So Esko it's a really interesting business. So I don't have the exact stats to hand, but the built environment I think contributes roughly about 20% in terms of carbon budget in Australia. And the best ways to green the economy is just to use less energy. That's the great model. And we typically, as a nation, focus very much on the supply solution. So how do you create green energy? There's an even more effective way, which is you just use less of it, and all of your instruments in everything you have in a given property or piece of land is more energy efficient or uses more electricity, green electricity, whatever is the case. What Esko does is it goes into a building, an office, or it goes into an aged care business or a university, and it says to that university, here's what you should invest in. Here are all the things you should do to your property to make it closer to net zero. So you should put on rooftop solar, you should put in batteries on one side, but you should also think about, using LED lighting or better sort of insulation or better heating and air conditioning. We'll move you to electric stoves instead, all of these kind of things, but all of that costs a lot of money. So they basically invest all of that capital up front on behalf of the owner of the asset. And then that owner pays them a 15 to 20-year revenue stream to manage that on their behalf. So you get this, the benefit to Esko of investing in Esko is it's got this capital deployment that has really cool long-term contracts off the back of it. The great thing for the asset owner is they don't have to pay money to build all the infrastructure that makes them greener and create energy savings. And effectively, the cost that they have to pay for doing that is offset by the savings they get from their energy and becoming more energy efficient anyway. So it's kind of it's a win-win. In the US, this is a really big market. So Esko's, companies like Ameresco are like a $5 billion listed company. In Australia, your typically company like Esko is like a $20 or $30 million company. And so you've got this really big growth opportunity in Australia across all the local councils, all the universities, all the big, office tower owners and social and affordable housing, and that all needs to be greener and smarter and more connected.
Yeah, right. Seems like very practical ways to sort of help businesses while also sort of doing good for themselves. Yeah, it's brilliant.
That's right. Yeah, and the reason we like it is the impact is the business model. You're delivering impact, which is reducing energy use and making a building greener, and that's how you earn your money, as opposed to impact being a sort of side part of the business.
Yeah, it's like baked into the business.
Yeah, that's right.
So what sort of risk and returns have you observed with these sort of investments like Esko and others?
Yeah, so typically what we see for these kind of investments is they're probably 200 to 300 basis points more return than traditional infrastructure, which we like. What you're getting for that is higher growth. So there's more growth to get there. You get yield that after a couple of years will be higher than traditional infrastructure, but in the early years you're growing the businesses, but you're also getting that with typically lower leverage than you would get. So yes, less use of debt than you'd have for a traditional infrastructure business as well. So I believe the risk-adjusted returns are really strong, which is one of the reasons I'm really focused on this as a sector. And that's really driven by the growth, but also the sort of stage of the market and the fact that at the moment you don't have a weight of capital looking at this sector or these different investments.
Yeah, awesome. So what are sort of some of the key areas you're following closely in Australia? You know, I'm thinking solar, storage, connectivity. What sort of interests you at the moment?
For me, there's sort of a number of strategies we like. So we're really interested in utility scale batteries. We think that's a key enabler for the economy. You know, the economics of a battery have got to the point where they're one of, if not the best sources of sort of storage for or dealing with intermittency of energy, of renewable energy. So we really like that. We think we much prefer that to be sort of utility scale. So it's a standalone battery and build a portfolio of them and invest with a company that builds, owns, manages those. We think that's a really, really interesting space, and we're looking and hopefully we'll progress to a term sheet with a really cool company in the next month or so. Group of folks that I've known for a long period of time, and I like them both as in terms of their capacity and skill set. They've got the broad skill set of doing this, but they're also really good human beings, which I think if you're partnering with someone to grow, you want to deal with people of high integrity, energy, and optimism. The other sector is around distributed energy, so energy as a service like Esko. If there was one sector I wanted to invest in and was most excited about, that was the one, because I think that's the gap in Australia at the moment. And I see this in all my, with all the hats I wear, I see the benefit of distributed energy as being so important. Distributed everything in Australia, I think, is important right now. In terms of waste, I'm really interested in sort of two areas. One is recycling. We're sort of working through a few different business models of how to make recycling work. Do you invest in a traditional business and invest in the recycling technology and capability and help it grow? That's one model, and a highly impactful one. The other is you just build a recycling business from scratch or invest in a sole recycling business. So we're pursuing both models, and we've got potential opportunities in both. And then the second area I'm focused on is biogas. So turning organics into sort of, in particular, biomethanol, which can then be used in the both in closed loop systems within sort of things like agriculture and livestock production and that kind of thing. But also increasingly we're seeing a number of biogas assets become grid connected, so they start to blend down the natural gas so that you're getting it from renewably derived sources. This is a model in Europe in particular. So in Europe, I think 26% of all natural gas has to come from renewably derived sources now. which is really pushing investment in the biogas space. And then the final sector we're really interested in is around last mile communications. So, Australia ranks 65th in the world in terms of internet connectivity, but also speed. And when you take into account the gap between urban and rural and rich and poor, the gap is enormous. Internet is the fourth utility, and Australia lags the rest of the world dramatically, particularly when it comes to people in low socioeconomic areas. So we're investing in a business that does two things that we like. One is it provides cheaper, faster internet to people in low socioeconomic areas, in particular low-cost housing and affordable housing, but it also enables the greening of buildings by facilitating smart technology. And inherently it uses about 1% the energy of traditional fibre, which means it's considerably greener, and you don't dig up the street, so it creates considerably less waste. So it's a really good business model. It's been highly successful in the UK and the US that use it quite extensively, relatively new here. And we find that really, could be a real game changer for Australia, or will be.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, I'm going to move on to my last questions, and then we're going to leave some time for Q&As. So my last question to you, Steve, is the recent IPCC report has just come out, and it's obviously communicates some very worrying scientific warnings about global warming. So how do you think the impact investing can contribute towards the solutions that we need? And do you think that individuals can sort of invest to truly make a difference?
Yeah, look, I think, so the short answer is yes. As I sort of mentioned in my preamble at the start, for me, you need to find financial solutions to this. You need, technology and finance to create an intersection with government that is able to pour trillions of dollars into this. And it needs to come from a broad base of solutions that are sort of, in some cases will have to come from the government, but the private sector has to play a massive role. And so investments that go into this with a financial return that can be scaled and bring and catalyse significant amounts of capital are absolutely critical. And doing that together with government, the private sector, investee companies is absolutely critical. This can't happen with, sort of philanthropy plus some government capital. It has to come with financial sector deployment at huge amounts of scale. And so impact investing is absolutely critical. In terms of one of the key things for that is for the financial sector is, where does that money come from, right? Like, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. And what we know is that traditionally all of that capital has come, or the significant majority has come from institutional capital, and then at best some sort of foundations and family offices and ultra high net worth capital. But what we know is that there's considerably more retail and non-institutionalized capital in the world than institutional. So if someone like Bloom can unlock that capital, then it's going to play a huge role in it. What you want, and indeed what we want, is you want to see competition come into the market. Because what I saw when I was at Macquarie is, it was great being sort of 80% market share in the infrastructure market, but it was even better being a 15% market share when the market grew 100 times, because you started getting competition and that kind of thing. And I think that's what Bloom will do. You will you'll grow this market substantially, still maintain preeminence, but there'll be a substantially larger market that comes in when you get all these other players that are looking at it and seeing it as interesting. And when everyone starts seeing that it's possible, and that means investors have choice and an opportunity, this will become a sort of substantial part of every fundraising that every asset manager has to do. So good on you for pulling it together, because I'm sure there were times when you're like, Jesus, this is hard.
Absolutely. Big shout out to the founders, Matron and Camille. They really weave the magic together.
They are phenomenal.
Awesome.
We can all learn something from the resilience.
Absolutely. Great. So I think I'm going to move on to some of the Q&As. I'm conscious of time and I want to try and get to as many as we can. So the first question comes from Kathy, Steve, and she asks, I would love a couple of examples of the businesses Palisade things are good investments, i.e. have good returns and do good.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for your question. So hopefully I covered off some of that in my in the earlier question. I think for me, two areas I find really interesting, both from a financial and an impact, is the distributed energy space. So Esko, I think will be a wonderful business for us to invest in. The returns will be, sort of mid to high teens, but also you'll get, every dollar they put out the door has a material impact on energy efficiency and carbon emissions. So that I really like. At the other end of the scale, as I mentioned, the business that we're looking at in the last mile communication space has the potential to really transform the market in terms of how digital infrastructure is delivered, both in terms of doing it more with a much lower carbon footprint, with much less waste, but also being able to provide buildings that are smarter and cleaner, and provide internet to people that don't have it now, which enables them to derive all the benefits from sort of critical infrastructure that the rest of us take for granted. So they're probably the bookends of everything we're looking at. And in the middle, there's plenty of other stuff to do.
Amazing. We have another question from Audrey. She says, Steve, what advice do you have for young professionals looking to work in the impact investment space?
Okay. What would I say? How long have you got? I think the key thing to think about is be curious, meet people, be useful when you talk to people, in terms of, the questions that you ask, be prepared to be yourself when you speak to people. Don't go in with the sort of pre-packaged response and questions that you think we want to hear, because all I personally want to hear is that you're yourself and you're honest with who you are. I think that's a great place to be. I would also be bold. I think the people that are in the impact space generally have two key characteristics. One is that they've had plenty of people that helped them in their careers over the years, and therefore have no barriers to helping other people. So just ask questions and be introduced to people. The second characteristic is that they inherently sort of want to help more generally. And so when you get those two combinations of things, there's a real willingness and open door to chat to people and that kind of thing. And then the third part, I think, is just ensuring that you spend a lot of time, learning about the space and what interests you, and wanting to go into it because you understand why it's interesting and there's something about it that really appeals to you. I think that's I'd give that advice on anything, to be honest. I think there's many sectors, and banking was one when I started, where the reality sometimes doesn't match the perception, and so making sure you ask the right questions and become interested in the space. But just get out there, meet people, be prepared to fail a little bit as you get into it, and do that, and then saving that, send me your CV.
Very sage advice, Steve, and I think it's so true. I've been in the impact investing space for a short period now, and it's so true. Everybody in this space so genuinely cares and really wants to make a difference, and it's not something you can pretend. If you're coming into the space, you can't pretend that you care. You have to really care. And I'll also say, I think it's a job for people who want to start at 9 and finish at 5. You've got to put a bit of heart and soul into it. So great advice,
right.
Steve.
That's right. But the purpose propels you, which is good.
Absolutely, yeah. Next question comes from Kim. Can you accept funds from a SMSF?
Yes.
Great. Next one's from Callum. Sorry, what internet tech was it that is greener than fibre? I think that's referring to when you're discussing this new internet.
Yeah, sure. So the tech that we use is called millimetre wave, or GFast, which effectively uses what's called virtual fibre, so a combination of radio towers as well as what's called a DSLAM that sits which is a DSL device that sits in a basement, and it basically takes all the copper wire in a building and changes the frequency so that you get broadband speed and access to the fibre. Is that too much detail or not enough?
No, I think that's interesting. Is that new tech? What is that?
It's probably 30-year-old tech that's been perfected over the last 5 years. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Callum said that's great. So perfect amount of information.
Okay. Thanks.
Our last question is going to come from Kathy. She says, how do you think about getting evidence measurements from your investments of the impact they are creating?
Okay, so we look to separate outputs and outcomes. So outputs are things like, how many homes do you provide digital connectivity for? Outputs. Outcomes are things like, for those people that got digital connectivity, how have we helped them get better jobs, access better education, and how do we collect that? So the sort of the tougher way to do that is through things like surveys and sort of downstream surveys and that kind of thing. Increasingly, we're looking to work with companies that have high quality sort of data mining technology that allows you to sort of do that and work with an algorithm that allows you to create those sort of data sets effectively. Probably the best capability in this comes out of New Zealand, where the social and environmental data they collect is like that's the Premier League, that stuff. In Australia, with some exceptions like parts of New South Wales, we generally don't collect that data well and then are able to mine it effectively. So we're doing our best, and we'll constantly try and evolve that sort of downstream stuff, but we're working with the best people to do that.
Amazing. I know I said that was the last question, but some came in, and I think we've got a little bit more time. So do you mind if I ask one or two more, Steve?
No problem.
So we've got a couple from Kevin. His first one is, any investments or thoughts on battery recycling? There needs to be a plan for all the e-bike, electric car, and grid batteries. Good point.
Yeah. So e-waste recycling generally is a big issue. And there are a number of companies that are looking at this in many ways, but at the moment the technology is probably not there yet. It's at the sort of the relative startup phase. So we think it's a really interesting space. Companies are calling it things like urban mining, this e-waste recycling. We got to fix that name. But putting that aside, it's on its way, but it's not there yet. A lot of this stuff ends in landfill or hazardous waste disposal. And so probably the intermittent step between e-waste recycling and where we're at now is probably managing better hazardous waste, given that the renewable sector is one of the biggest creators of hazardous waste in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. There's another question from Kevin. He says, what are your thoughts on the app? Any feedback / favourite feature? And are you personally invested in Bloom?
I like the app. I think that the reporting part of it will be the reporting part of it. I think it will be absolutely critical. I'm not in Bloom because I'm actually in. All my money's tied up in the fund that I've just raised, but I'm very happy to invest in Bloom when I get a bit of liquidity shortly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. There is one more question from Kim, which I can answer. She says, when will investment programs be available on the app? Kim, they are really available. So we have one green fund that you can invest in through the app when you download it. And that includes a lot of goodies that we discussed today, like Esko, it always has green squares, a lot of other really great impact solutions and projects that are making a true difference and making a true climate impact. So you can go onto our website, or of course, send us a message if you have any questions at all relating to the app or the fund. We are very, very happy to answer them. Oh, thank you, Kathy. We just had a sign up. Love that. Outstanding. Great. So that's going to be a wrap. Thank you so much to everyone who joined this webinar today. I really hope that you took away some practical knowledge and insights into impact investing and just how powerful it can be to align your finances with climate action. We're really proud. Our community does keep growing. We are now 1,200 members strong, which is great, but we would really, really love your help to keep growing because we want to make the biggest possible impact that we can. So if you enjoyed today, if you found any value from it, please invite your friends and colleagues or anyone else you might think would find these conversations useful, and give us a follow on social media. We are, if I can say, making some great content, but I am biased as the marketing manager. I'd like to personally thank Steve for coming today, making the time, teaching us, all that he has, and to everybody, all our attendees, for staying true to your commitment to learn and stay curious. I'm really excited to kind of continue the Bloom journey together. I'm going to do a quick little plug and just post our newsletter sign up and some social media links that we have. But yeah, if you just Google us, you can pretty much find us. Thank you so much again. We will be sending this recording to everyone who signed up. Have a really great evening, Steve, and have a really great evening to everybody else.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anna.
See ya.